Hey everyone, welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs. I am your host, Katie Harbath. Today we are talking to my friend and former Meta colleague, well, then it was Facebook, Michael Bąk. Michael was the head of public policy in Thailand for Meta. He has a long history of working in both civil society and tech. Before Facebook, he was at the United Nations. He's worked at USAID. He has a really interesting cross-section of that kind of civil society and technology background, particularly in Asia. And now he's the executive director on the Forum on Information and Democracy, which is the implementing entity of the Partnership on Information and Democracy, which is an international process to establish, promote, and implement democratic principles in global communication and the information space. Michael goes a lot more into all of the great work that he is doing, and I'm really glad to be able to bring you this conversation. Enjoy. All right. Well, Michael, welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs. Thank you for joining us.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off a little bit first with telling us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and some of the work that you do.
Well, apart from having had the great honor of working with you in the past at Facebook, I've been working in democracy and governance, peace building, human rights for the last 25 years, mostly out here in Asia. And to be honest, it started with, and this is a blast from the past, the Bosnian Civil War from 1992 to 1996. I was in college and I watched this take place on TV. It was probably one of the first televised, events of its kind, very bad events. But it made me think a lot about my own personal history. I'm a family of immigrants, thinking about how I could have been born on the other side of the wall in a different place and time. And that's what really got me into thinking about human rights and people on the move and refugees and democracy. And it led me into an amazing career with USAID, with the United Nations, and then with Facebook. And I'll tell you, I've worked with cutting edge technology like fax machines and then ended up using social media. So it's really run the gamut over the years.
And I'm sure you've got AI too that you're trying to figure out.
Well, I'm not going to give up all of my little secrets, but I might be dabbling here and there in AI. Absolutely. It's the next evolution.
And can you dig a little bit deeper? What does it mean to work in this civil rights space, to do work with USAID and then sort of the policy work that you were doing at Facebook?
Yeah, I get this question, or sometimes I get a curious look from people. How did I make that jump from international development to the private sector, to a company as big as Facebook? Uh, and I think it was a pretty natural transition. It, Thinking back to the cutting edge technology and fax machines, I deployed that in conflict areas in Indonesia for the purpose of allowing independent media and independent voices to be able to get out from these conflict zones, particularly those areas where the government was really controlling the news. And so we gave out fax machines to NGOs. They often ended up in coffee shops where journalists and citizen journalists could show up and share the news. And so this transition then, once we saw the evolution of social media, it was really viewed as kind of the manna from heaven, this new technology that democratized information, allowed people who were powerless before to finally have a voice, to be able to participate. And for me, that was really exciting to go from the international development space and then work within a private company that allowed me to continue to do that and to help shape how the technology was able to serve people in positive ways. And that's how I made that jump.
That's amazing. And you're now at the Forum on Information and Democracy. Tell us a bit more about that organization and what their mission is.
So I joined the forum just under a year ago, and it's the civil society implementing body for the Partnership on Information and Democracy. That is a non-binding international process that was started 4 years ago at, in collaboration between the French government and Reporters Without Borders. It was launched at the UN General Assembly in 2019. I think there are about 12 states that signed up, and today we have 52 countries that have signed up to these principles, which are really meant to uh, demonstrate a commitment to promote and implement democratic principles in the information and communication space. Really kind of acknowledging the, the challenges that came out of the technology. That initially we thought in the democracy space that social media was, um, this new equalizing democratic force, and then we started to see kind of the underbelly and the problems. And so this was started 4 years ago. The forum implements those principles uh, through working on evidence, working on policy, and a global coalition of NGOs to help shape policy discussions and to shape the way policymakers approach some of these really incredibly challenging issues.
That's fascinating. And for those that aren't familiar, um, there's a lot of these different types of bodies kind of all around the world. Like here, Michael was talking about USAID. They fund a lot of implementing organizations like the International Republican Institute that I worked at, the National Democratic Institute, IFIS, which works with electoral commissions. And so there's a lot of these different types of organizations that go and they came out of the 80s and the Cold War to try to help promote democracy and help countries continue to build democracy, and we continue to see those evolve. And Michael, one thing I wanted to start off with that I think is a really important and interesting discussion is talking about information integrity and the overall information environment. And why do you think it's important for us to be talking about information integrity, and what does that mean?
Well, information is all around us. We create it, we consume it, we share it. And information is the bedrock of our democratic discourse. And we have to make sure that uh, we can agree on that information. A friend of mine, you might know her, she was a Nobel laureate, Maria Ressa. She said that without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. And without all three, we have no shared reality. And democracy as we know it is dead. And I think it's absolutely true. If we can't agree on the basic facts, we can't possibly have constructive political discourse that helps to shape our societies, our legal frameworks, to preserve the rights for us and for others within our community. And I think uh, protecting the integrity of information, how it's created, how it's shared, how we process it, is really important. If we're constantly inundated with information that lacks credibility, that may be that is misdirecting the truth, misrepresenting the truth, if we're constantly bombarded with that and we don't know where to go to find information that we can trust, we're going to have a hard time having conversations about really tough issues because we'll have been looking at it from very different perspectives that are based on fundamentally different notions of what the facts are. And so we think that protecting and promoting reliable information in different ways, you can use technology, you can promote independent journalism, you can promote standards which people can look to recognize when media sources are trusted. So, for example, Reporters Without Borders has a journalism trust initiative, which basically uses an international standards framework to help people identify news sources that are trustworthy, where they media do their jobs the way they've historically done their jobs. Um, And we think that without being able to rely on information that is reliable, like I said, we're going to have a real tough time addressing the day-to-day challenges that democracies face. I mean, you see the polarization occurring. I'm not going to say that the polarization we face today is solely the result of the lack of credible information. We've been seeing polarization in America for the last few decades. It predates even social media technology. So it's not fair to blame everything on that. Um, and so that's what we work toward. And the work that we do is to advance this idea that not only do we have the right to information and thought and to impart that on other people, but we have the right to access reliable information. And there's a burden on states to ensure that that's possible. There's a burden on the private sector who develop platforms that transmit information. They have a responsibility and need to be accountable to how they either contribute to reliable information or don't. And then there's a burden on citizens to be um, seek out diverse and pluralistic viewpoints and to ensure that they aren't creating their own bubbles and filters, that they remain open to other perspectives that are, drawn on commonly held facts.
And who do you think should be involved in these conversations? Because you've talked about there's a lot of different players, right? There's the technology companies themselves, there's regulators, there's civil society, there's academia. How do you see these conversations in an ideal world happening and sort of that balance of power?
I love how you phrase this, Katie, the balance of power, because it really is about power and who has the resources, who has the money to show up, who has the money to participate. And I kind of put into this one sentence that I believe that our governments have a responsibility to create the conditions in which civil society can equitably, substantively, and on a sustained basis show up wherever agendas are being set and policies being discussed. Let me unpack that just a little bit because I think it's really, really important. Civil society brings an awful lot of lived experience, expertise, uh, cultural, regional, linguistic perspectives, and other important socioeconomic contributions to the development of technology, to the information space. And I think that civil society needs to have the opportunity to be able to show up equitably. What does that mean? Show up equitably. It means that governments and other stakeholders need to recognize that civil society doesn't always have the luxury to jump on an airplane tomorrow to attend a hearing or to participate in a multilateral dialogue. Substantively means that civil society has the skills needed to be able to unpack some of these tough technology issues and be able to weigh in a useful way that advances the conversation. And on a sustained basis means it's not a checkbox exercise. It's not a one-off kind of thing. So it has to be equitable, substantive, and on a sustained basis. And I think there are two times where this is really, really important. It's when agendas are being set and when policies are being discussed. I'll give you an example. Last autumn, the UK held an AI summit at Bletchley Park. I think you've commented on it, and a lot of your friends may have participated. I had a look at the leaked guest list that was made it into the press a few days before the actual event. There are about 110 people on this list, and I looked at who was invited, And it was really striking. Only 3% of the participants at Bletchley Park were from civil society, at least based on my calculations. No human rights organizations or journalist organizations were included in that. And if you look at the representation from the global majority, if you take out, governments and look at other stakeholders, it was just slightly over 8% of participants from the global majority. And I think if you added in the countries uh, that were invited, like Rwanda and others, it was about 11%. It wasn't much of a difference. But the truly fascinating aspect is that uh, nearly two-thirds of the participants came from the US and the UK, and a third of them were from the private sector. To me, that's very, very lopsided. And and representation at agenda setting moments is absolutely crucial because that's where you rack and stack the potential harms, where you're deciding what is harmful for you and what is harmful for me and what the priorities should be and where resources should be directed. And so to your question about, who needs to show up, it needs to be a collective effort. I mean, we have multilateralism and multilateral institutions for a reason. And I think when we're talking about these really wicked technology challenges, we need to tap brain power and expertise wherever we can. And it's not entirely in the private sector. I mean, it's really great, and it's fascinating to see, people like what's his name from Elon Musk showing up and kind of having his show at Bletchley Park. But just because you're a tech executive making lots and lots of money, I don't think makes you an oracle on where technology is going. And it certainly doesn't have to bend in the direction that they want. And this is where having multi stakeholders involved in setting agendas and governments involved to engage in regulation that can bend technology in a direction that serves citizens and the public good, and not solely the return on capital and returns for shareholders, because those incentives are very, very different.
For those that might not be familiar, can you define the global majority? Because I think that this is a really important thing for people to be aware of, especially if they are in the Western world and in particular the US and Europe, because I think that to your point, folks in the global majority are oftentimes not included in a lot of these conversations.
I would probably say most all of the times they're not included, and you run up against structural reasons. I've raised this with some multilaterals, and they'll say things like, "Oh well, it's hard for people to get visas." Well, then maybe the multilaterals need to show up where the global majority are. Instead of meeting in a place like Paris or London, you meet in Lagos or Jakarta and have these really critical conversations. The global majority is the majority of the world. It's people who either live outside of the global north or are representative of non-northern countries. And why this is important is that if you look at the vast majority of research that is um, cited by regulators and academics, the lion's share comes from the North, and most likely from a handful of very, very good institutions, academic institutions and think tanks. But it is, Northern perspectives. And there's an awful lot of experience occurring in the rest of the world. And, and unfortunately, there's also a dearth of resources available to conduct much needed research in other parts of the world to feed into our thinking around any kind of global regulation or even regional regulation. And this is also important, even if it's, because some people might say, well, if we're creating regulations in my country or in the EU, that's our business, and we'll bring our best experts forward. You, but you've heard of this thing called the Brussels effect, right? Where you have GDPR is a real good example, DSA, DMA, and fortunately or unfortunately, the EU, other multilaterals take a lead and a leadership role in regulations in these environments, and that's really important. But they have to bear in mind that it often trickles down into uh, other governance systems in other parts of the world, and it's really important to ensure that you're getting input and voices from other parts of the world so that when you are creating these regulations, that it'll be much more difficult for bad regimes to repurpose good intentions to prop up bad governance systems and so forth. Um, so I could talk for a long time about global majority, frankly, but I guess I'll leave it at that.
Cool. And I want to shift a little bit because you were mentioning that Brussels effect. And one of the arguments we also hear too a lot, particularly about Europe and regulation, and this is argument I hear a lot here in the States, is that regulation will stifle innovation. And you recently wrote a piece saying that this isn't true, and we'll link to the piece in all of the show notes. But can you expand on that and what you wrote?
Sure. So I I think that technology companies have successfully captured the policy narratives around this, and they've convinced regulators and politicians that if you regulate too much, you're going to stifle our ability to introduce really important, really innovative things into the economy. And you don't want to miss out because if you stifle it, it's going to be your fault. Well, the thing is this, is that just because you can invent something and release something into the wild doesn't mean that you should be able to do that without ensuring that uh, it minimizes, reduces, and mitigates harms. That requires a substantial investment, particularly when we're talking about AI, which is, I can't underscore how this may fundamentally change uh, society in so many different ways. And when you have something that's so transformational, it's imperative that uh, you have regulatory frameworks that bend it in a direction that will benefit citizens and societies first and foremost. And that's not stifling innovation, that's directed in a way that creates utility and ensures the strength of our democratic institutions. We've seen the experiment with social media where you invent, you release, you iterate. You may solve some of the problems in some countries, and not all the time, and not everywhere. And with executives saying, "Well, just trust us. We'll fix it," apologizing, and I think the stakes are too high to repeat that. And uh, creating democratic safeguards and frameworks and rules by which those who are developing and deploying AI systems, for example, have to follow just makes sense.
So let's shift over to elections because you all have also put out a policy brief urging technology companies and governments to combat digital elections threats. As you know, and everybody knows, it's a huge election year this year. Can you tell us more about what you all are recommending?
Sure. So this was a really interesting project because, as you know, I've done a lot of election work in my life, election monitoring. And, the inspiration for this, honestly, was really you, Katie, because I think you were one of the, if not the first person to sound the alarm about the year of elections this year. I'm not sure anyone really connected the dots until
I
you
know I was
did.
talking about it alone for many years until all of a sudden everyone woke up.
You were, and then you put together that incredible map, which really, I think, pulled it all together in such a visual way that anyone else who tries to take credit for it is not being fully truthful. I think the credit lies with you. So thank you so much for that. Uh, so this policy brief was really taking from the hundreds and hundreds of recommendations that the forum has put together over the years in a series of reports that we've done in a way that would be easy for policymakers and for companies to look at top priorities, top actions that they can take that are reasonable, that are actionable, and that can be accomplished, and that are really important. And by the way, we did another one in the autumn around peace building and information integrity in times of conflict. So just a plug to check out that, which was also exciting. But this election stuff, we sort of focused on recommendations for companies and recommendations for governments. And it was really, a lot of it was around the plurality of information and ensuring the reliability of information using different technical and regulatory means, addressing dis and misinformation, and how companies can actually dial back the the velocity of content that may be misinformation, and to adjust for that. Uh, and a really important area is around the independent scrutiny of efforts. So it's one thing for companies to say, yes, we'll do this. These are our policies, and we'll implement that. And it's another to be able to verify it. So trust but verify. And it's really important that independent researchers are able to access appropriate data to be able to confirm or not that companies follow the rules, their own policies, and are keeping people safe and protecting, the institution of elections. Um, uh, the other areas around um, enforcement of content policies for all people, and to have review mechanisms in place where people can contest a content decision that a platform may have made, and to have that done in a very quick time frame, particularly during elections. I don't think it's a good idea to give, free passes to people who are politicians. I often think that when you hear, the newsworthy exceptions for a political figure who has said something really nasty or brutish or just patently false, or hate speech. We've seen that happen. I'm not sure that that's a legitimate free pass, and platforms need to be able to enforce that, because otherwise it comes across as really quite arbitrary when it's convenient for a platform to ban someone, or sorry, not ban, but moderate their content or otherwise. I think the only way to really address this is through transparency, and to really understand what are some of these tough trade-offs that they are facing. I don't think it's enough to say, oh, it's really difficult, and we're walking a fine line, or we're trying to implement our policies. I think there needs to be some collaborative discourse around this amongst key stakeholders. And one other suggestion is, and I think this is really important, recognizing the important role civil society plays. Platforms often have white glove channels for governments to be able to request content to be removed because it violates either local law or platform policies. Civil society often has a channel to report. It may or may not be addressed in a speedy fashion, or at all. And I think it's really important that white glove service be given to civil society partners as well, and that platforms report on that they let us know how they're addressing the challenges that are raised both by government and by civil society, and to help us understand the actions they've taken. And this is particularly important in governance contexts that may be less than democratic. And I'm sure you've done some work in some of those countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also everyone's favorite topic of artificial intelligence. And you kind of alluded to that at the beginning because you all also put out a massive framework of 200 suggestions around artificial intelligence. Tell us a bit more about that as well and what you're seeing and what you're recommending.
We did. We launched on February 28th. I think it was the 28th of February, just before the leap year. 200 around 200 plus recommendations, actionable recommendations to platforms, governments, and civil society. But what I think is really important, and I'd love to share with you, Katie, is that the process in how we develop these recommendations is really, really important. This was not just me and my team sitting down, hashing out what we think are really important recommendations, with people sitting in Paris and myself to do that. It's really been a meaningful process where we had a policy working group of 14 eminent personalities, experts in artificial intelligence from around the world. 14 people, half male, half female, and almost parity in global majority versus global north makeup of this group. They covered a range of disciplines, from computer science to legal and so forth. And the discussions were really rich in identifying key areas to look at and how to define the scope of the report. Because as you know, AI touches on so many different things and it's so broad. And we're really looking at its impact on our democracy, on the information and communication space, the sort of foundational elements of democracy. So this working group, working with rapporteurs, expert rapporteurs in public policy and computer science, interviewed hundreds of people from around the world to solicit their ideas, their experience, their suggestions, their expertise to be able to craft these recommendations, which we think are extremely actionable. And they cover a range of areas. It's divided into a few chapters, but we're looking at authenticity and provenance of AI content, including author authentication, so that people can understand what they're looking at and whether it was created by a non-human. Legal frameworks that clearly define the rights that I have, the rights that you have, the rights that communities have when it comes to the right to be informed and to understand and receive explanations on why an AI system has spit out the kind of information as it did. We cover diversity and addressing bias, which is definitely talked a lot about in the news as more and more people recognize the systemic challenges we face because the companies developing these systems and deploying them do not themselves necessarily represent the diversity of our world, and particularly that of the global majority. So there are a range of actionable recommendations. We also, the title is AI as a public good. So the whole notion is that this is a kind of fundamental technology that can ignite so many other downstream innovations. And therefore, it's absolutely imperative to get it right because AI is not something that anyone can opt out of. Too much of the things that control our, that guide our lives, that help us navigate the world, even create opportunities for us, is dominated by AI, and that will only increase. And so that's why we think that it should be treated like a public good. And we also introduced this really interesting idea of fair trade AI, thinking about, uh, fair trade in commodities like coffee or tea, and all that this means for ensuring that consumers and the market can force developers and employers to moderate their systems, to create them in a way that meets particular standards of diversity, inclusion, of safety, addressing various harms, and so forth. And I think that's a really cool idea, and I think it's kind of a Big Ten idea that is worthy of exploration by probably people who are much smarter than I am.
Well, I got two more questions for you. The first is that, so my podcast, it's called Impossible Trade-Offs, because I know you and me and many others, when we were at tech companies, those still at the companies, in civil society and others, when you're making these types of recommendations, there's a lot of hard trade-offs that you have to think through. And I'm curious, what were the ones that were hardest for you all to reconcile in determining what you wanted to recommend should be done?
Yeah, so what AI is so complex, it is so big, it touches on so much. A huge challenge is just limiting the universe of what we want to address. Our focus is on impact on democratic systems, information communication space. But there's so many things that are related, and having to cut things out or not address it, with those were some tough choices, because otherwise you'll end up with 1,000-page report that no one's going to read. And we wanted to keep it manageable and focused. One area I remember having some talks about is around diversity and inclusion. This is a really important thing for me. It has been throughout my career. And uh, I mentioned earlier that we face some systemic challenges to being able to improve our diversity and inclusion, addressing bias. Part of that is around, you look at the way uh, our universities are structured for engineers. There are no incentives to ensure that an engineer graduates also with a sound understanding of international human rights law, or humanitarian law, or philosophy, or ethics, or political science, or international relations. And there's a whole discussion around that, and books are written about that, of how do you change these incentives so that universities are recruiting not only a diverse student body, but that student body is also being uh, has access to a more diverse curriculum. And currently, the incentives are not set up to support that. And so then you end up with really good software engineers who are really good people, just being hyper focused on the engineering without fully contemplating the ethical implications or the uh, interstate relations implications that may come of that. So that was really tough, I think, to say, yeah, that's gonna have to be another piece, and not included. Um, and yeah, that's one of the one that comes to my mind
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah, that ruthless prioritization when there's so many different things
Yes.
and so many facets to these problems, right? Like that's and like what you were saying too, I think is a really important one is like no one person can know everything. And so you really need to think about, how you pull in all these different perspectives and stuff like that. Last question for you is we've talked a lot about how you've gone in and out of tech and civil society for your entire career. What's something that you think each gets sort of wrong about one another, and what do they get right in these conversations?
This is a really great question, and I think so. I need to preface this with the fact that uh, there's no the intention. I think people from both tech and civil society approach these issues with really good intentions. And because of the power imbalances in particular, this is where we kind of don't always align. So when I think about tech, very well resourced, lots of money, high, high paced, fast paced environment. Uh, as you mentioned, having to ruthlessly prioritize things. And I think sometimes tech, folks in tech, can think that they know more than civil society counterparts. I've heard too many times things like, "Oh, they just don't understand. They don't see the big picture, or they don't understand what it's like to work at scale." And I think those are kind of unfair assumptions because I do think that folks within civil society can understand that. Um, I also think that oftentimes tech folks forget that civil society doesn't only work in 30-minute blocks, that there's a lot more discussion time that takes place.
Yeah,
So
I
then,
had to
then
I had to reorient to that when I left Facebook and went back into civil society myself. And I was like, what are these hour-long meetings that people are putting on my
oh,
calendar?
only hour long. Yeah,
I know,
there's
right? Even longer.
there's a lot more, yeah, a lot more discussion and talking and so forth. So from and then to answer your question from the civil society side, is that I I don't think it's always appreciated that there really are well-meaning people working in these tech companies that are, making impossible trade-offs every day, trying to ruthlessly prioritize in a way that where they're thinking about the real world implications of that prioritization. Uh, at the same time, I think that the civil society folks also don't realize that the people they speak with in tech companies aren't necessarily the ones who are making the decisions. And I think Maria Ressa touched on this in her book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator, about how she encountered really well-meaning people, in public policy and comms, but they didn't have the full picture that the executives had, and weren't the ones making ultimately the decisions that had an impact on so many people. Uh, so I think those would be the two perspectives. Uh, Ultimately, I think there's so much space for there to be collaboration, in ways that will help both of these communities to enrich their work and to be successful in what they're trying to accomplish.
That's amazing. Well, we'll leave it there. Michael, I really appreciate you joining us. Tell us again where you're joining us from.
I'm I'm in Thailand. I'm not far from a beach, I will admit, but I am on childcare duty for my best friend. So I'm it's not all beach and sun.
Well, I appreciate you joining us because we had to figure out all the time zones and everything. But thank you for joining us, and I'll put links to everything that you all are working on in the show notes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Katie, and keep up the good work.
Thanks.